Okay? Am I live? I'm live. I'm as live as I can be with a case of pneumonia from Washington. I may have to take a few sneeze breaks here. Listen, last Monday, before I had to leave and go to Washington, I was talking about the kind of pedagogical device that I want to use in the course to deal with certain periods of history that are extremely important for shedding light on what it is that we're going to be confronting together here in these next 20 years in light of this crisis that I'm talking about here. And I talked about the first concentric circle being that period during your lifetimes that starts basically at the very end of the Cold War. On December 31st of 1991, we can effectively call it 1992, all the way up to now, basically the 22, 23-year period during which most of you have lived. Because that's meaningful to you. It's things that you may have either heard about while they're happening or you've heard about them as recent history during your lives. And so I wanted that to be the first concentric circle of information that we dealt with, so as to ground you clearly in what it is that the reason why we're talking about all the other stuff. And then the second concentric circle that I was talking about was that period of time during the lives of my generation, the baby boom generation, between our birth up to the time when you were born. That's that whole period from basically 1945 at the end of World War II up to the point where you guys started being born, right at the end of the Cold War. So that entire duration of the Cold War. Now I know that the Cold War sounds boring to you because as I said before, it's a little hard for me to conceive of it, but it's probably in the same category as the Civil War and the Revolutionary War and things like that to you guys, because that's all part of the history before you were born. And so they all kind of look alike or feel alike because you have no feeling experience to relate it to. So it's all kind of abstract. And it gets even worse as we go back into the larger concentric circles, which is the third concentric circle, which is that period of time that from the beginning of World War I all the way up to the beginning of World War II. That whole period from 1914 all the way up to 1945. Which entails the run-up to World War I and the following World War I and the entire configuration, for example, of all the Middle Eastern countries that were set up at the end of World War I by a commission that was headed up by Churchill, the Minister of Colonial Affairs for the United Kingdom. And they set up all of these nation states that you see crumbling now. Over in the Middle East, all of these kind of artificial countries of Syria and Libya and eventually Saudi Arabia and all of these others, they were set up by a commission of 22 white people that just sort of designated geographic areas and jammed a whole bunch of tribes together, regardless of whatever their animosities were toward each other. They put them into a particular nation state and then assigned it to one of the allies so they could get the oil from that area. And so I plan to go through a series of these concentric circles there, and we eventually get all the way back into the period of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and some of the earlier thinkers of Western civilization. Which I want to track back up out of their thinking to get us all the way up to the all-important moment of the Crane-Brinton speech that I told you about in December of 1968, or 67 rather, in which Crane-Brinton said that he was convinced that the greatest minds in the history of the world had all come to a common insight. That we were on the very brink of the evolution of this biological faculty, which he then described, and which I've described a number of times. And I am postulating the thesis that this is an accurate assessment on his part of the most important intellectual idea And the irony is, and I want to deal with this irony today, the irony is that what has been designated as the most important single intellectual insight of our entire human family by the 35-year chairman of the Department of Intellectual History at Harvard University is basically held in complete disdain by the academy at the present time. The entire realm of political theory in the universities basically considers all of that kind of talk to be magical thinking, is the term that they use for it. And so what I want to do is I want to avoid the death spiral of my going through one concentric circle of history after another and watching the dullness of your eyes increase as I'm talking about all that kind of stuff. I don't want to go down that road. What I want to do is I want to back up out of that, and I want to get to this kind of intense philosophical issue that you're going to have to come to grips with as part of the academy. If you're going to be public intellectuals, that one whole part of your life has to be spent in the academy in order to have the credentials and, frankly, the vocabulary and the conceptual structures to work rather fluently with these kind of ideas and things that you need to be able to deal with to let everybody know that you're an intellectual. In order to get it out in your writings and in your talks and in your speeches and your blogs or whatever it is that you're going to be using as your vehicle for this work as a public intellectual, there's a certain demand that you have to meet to display a thoroughgoing academic education in order to engender that type of respect as an intellectual. And so that you're going to spend a fair amount of your time in the academy, maybe teaching in the academy, lecturing in the academy, at least going through the entire PhD process in the academy. And you're going to have to understand that you're going to be subjected throughout that process to this kind of constant hammering from the academy, which is going to try to get you convinced that if you're going to have any kind of recognition as a person who is worthy of having a discussion about political theory, that you have to stop thinking like this. You have to stop thinking like that there's some kind of biological faculty or that cosmology actually means anything. I don't want to fall prey to the same flaw that I think people in the academy are guilty of, and that is that they speak with disdain toward people who are attempting to elucidate this particular all-important concept that Crane Brinton is talking about. And they adopt this kind of aristocratic, kind of condescending, dismissive tone toward the whole thing. And you don't usually hear them get into any kind of detail about it. In fact, they don't read this stuff, even of scientists and professionals in the realm of other pertinent fields, but they just hold it in disdain. It's kind of almost like a bizarre superstition that they have. So I don't want to do that. I don't want to be holding the people in disdain who are trained in the academy and who talk like that. What I want to do is I want to draw them up into a meaningful and an intelligent conversation about the substance of this particular thesis, because I think it's extraordinarily important for all of us to become familiar with this. And so what I want to do is I want to, as I say, I want to avoid the being guilty of boring you with simple, articulations of different aspects of history that go together to make up the particular political moment in which we find ourselves, as liberals and progressives confronted by the reactionaries in the country, and they seem to be growing more and more in strength. This image that we just came through with the elections, the midterm elections, where where all of the pundits seem to be saying, oh, look how conservative the people in the country really are. Look what they really do when it comes push to pull, and they end up electing a whole bunch of these yahoos who basically embarrass you. Talking about legitimate rapes. And if it's a really legitimate rape, a woman's body has a way of shutting down and making certain that they don't get pregnant if they're actually raped. And other people who've even been vice presidential candidates talking about standing on their porch in Alaska looking over into Russia. And very recently, she also had a very interesting thing about how they have to put up a flotilla across the Mexican Ocean. The Mexican Ocean to keep the Mexicans from coming into the United States. And that's what we ought to be doing, is enlisting our Navy to keep the Mexicans from coming across the Mexican Ocean into the country. And one would think that one could simply hold them up to the light and that they would not therefore be realistic contenders for any, yes?
Yeah, can you speak more to that? Like, doesn't she have like a handler or something who like helps?
No. In fact, she takes some great pride in the fact that she's not to be handled. That no one's going to constrain her, no one's going to coach her. That she's going to just say these things. And others, the other people, the other guys that say these extraordinary things that they say, and get elected, and so what I'm saying is that we seem to find ourselves here at a particular moment where the reactionaries appear to be in the ascendancy, and that the whole idea of being a liberal or a progressive, borders on treason. And in fact, there's intelligent conversation going on that there are lists being kept of people who are deemed to be liberals and progressives that are on a list, they call it the ADEX list, the administrative index, of people that are to be picked up and incarcerated in the event that the president declares a state of national emergency. And in this regard, I want to emphasize and be serious now about the request that I made to you for you to get a copy of The Deep State by Peter Dale Scott. And you'll notice I haven't been very insistent upon you reading a lot of stuff or even spending a lot of time having to prepare for this class, but that part of the class is over. Okay, I mean, it's fun to come together and talk about this and just have to listen and stuff. It's like going to a movie, but the reality is now we've got to dig in on this thing. So I want you to get a copy of that book called The Deep State by Peter Dale Scott, and I want you to read the thing. Now, and I'm not saying you have to sit down and make notes in the margins like I did, making myself crazy on the airplane back and forth to Washington. But I've written all through the margins and standing on my head on this thing about differences of opinion that I have with Peter on some of these things. But I want you to get that book and I want you to read it, because I want you to see a person who is a respected scholar, who is with 650 footnotes, detailing specific documented proof of the existence of this kind of dynamic that's going on in the country right now. And he points out that this particular dynamic has been present in the country. He tracks it all the way back to the Palmer raids, 1923, 1924 Palmer raids, where J. Edgar Hoover came into our world and headed up the first intelligence division of the Federal Investigation Bureau, at that time it was called. And so he'll track all of that for you. But I want you to get that under you as a ground to understand that there is a solid, academically detailed and explicated exposition of this particular state of affairs that we are in right now. But there is a second book now that I'm going to want you to get. And this is actually a 4-volume book. It's the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Because I'm not going to have us going down 1,800 little rabbit holes on philosophy on this thing, but I want you to get this book. It's a 4-volume set. It costs $45, but you can talk to Scott, and Scott will help you get it, or you can order it right on the Amazon. It's $45. They're used, but they're in perfectly good shape. I've got a set of them. Okay, for $45, it's the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The editor is Paul Edwards, and it's from Macmillan and the Free Press out of New York. And there's a supplement to it. I haven't gotten that yet, but you can get that too. But I want this to be our text because I have found this to be an absolutely extraordinary set of books. It's in 4 volumes, but it's actually, I think, 8. There's 2 volumes in each one of the bound volumes. And it covers everything from existentialism to the concept of the absolute to any philosophical thinker or writer is there, and they have a 3 to 4 page discussion of their thinking and their the best writings and a bibliography of things to read about them. And so it's a great text for us to work with. And some people will hold it in some disregard because it's how can you cover Nietzsche in 4 pages? But the fact is Nietzsche can be covered in 4 pages if you understand it, and so that's what we're going to be working with. So when we get into the course and we start this discussion about these people and these worldviews that I've talked about, and I'm perfectly aware of the fact that some people aren't aware of what the support is for the existence of these worldviews. And that's why we're going to be talking about it. I want you armed with this knowledge when you go out into the world. I don't want people just poo-pooing it because they happen not to have paid any attention to this stuff. So I want you to know about this. And so what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be attempting to start, at least, with this particular thesis that we have, that we're in this present crisis. We're confronted by the apparent rise of the reactionaries. It's important to understand the difference between a reactionary and a mere conservative. And it's important for you to understand the difference between a conservative and a moderate. And you need to understand, all importantly, the difference between a moderate and a liberal and a progressive. You've got to understand the difference between these people, because what's happening here is that since the end of the Cold War, right at the beginning of when you were born, there has been this steady erosion of the Democratic Party to the point where it basically espouses nothing progressive and nothing even liberal, and is taking great pride in it being moderate. And they're trying to convince people that they have to do that, or else the reactionaries are going to take over the world. And while they're saying this to you, the reactionaries are taking over the world. And so you want to say to them, how's that working for you there? Because they are not confronting the reactionaries. They're just giving in to them. And so that it's I'm intending to help train you on how to confront the reactionaries, how to deal with the reactionaries, but you have to understand the progressive worldview. And you need to know about what the liberal worldview is, because there are allies. And there's some moderates that can even be our allies. But you need to know how they think and why they think that way, so that you can talk with the people in a way that is not disdainful or disrespectful. Because as I pointed out, the distinction that exists between these worldviews is predicated upon certain assumptions about these cosmic ideas, and that we are no more capable of proving beyond any reasonable doubt that our assumptions about these cosmic questions are any more true than theirs. But what we do not want to do is we do not want to go down into that black hole of postmodernism. Where basically everybody's got an idea and who cares, and they can just be completely pluralistic and everybody respect everybody, no matter how lunatic they are. unless, of course, they're clinically ill, which they have this whole arbitrary line for. Well, that person's clinically ill, so you don't have to pay attention to them. For a person to have any respect inside the academy, they have to hold in low regard a lot of the things that I'm trying to teach you about. I'm trying to talk to you about this metaphysical dimension that actually exists, and these subtle electromagnetic fields that actually exist that our human body is responsive to, and that it actually has an effect upon what causes people to attach themselves to one or another of these worldviews, despite the fact that the ultimate questions of fact cannot in fact be proven one way or another yet. And yet it's a very real phenomenon in our world that these factions, these worldviews actually exist. And in fact, we're part of it. I mean, that we're just as instinctive and aggressive about our progressive or liberal views as people who are reactionaries are. And moderates, even though it's hard to discover them because they kind of basically are identified by their not saying much and kind of waiting for others to wear themselves out, and then they figure out where the middle is on this thing, and then they figure that's being the way of being a peacekeeper. We're all working together now. We're all working together to try to figure out about this particular scheme that I've set forth here, and that I'll talk about in much more detail, where I actually set forth the cosmological, teleological, ontological, and epistemological assumptions of the worldview, and begin to discuss how it is that an internally and self-referentially consistent answer to all four of those questions can generate a principle which, when applied to the normal events of your life, in generating answers to the questions that are posed by the normal experiences we have in our life, will actually generate a philosophy. I mean, I'm just astonished still at how people can get a PhD in philosophy and not be able to answer the question about what the hell is a philosophy. I mean, really, you sit there, you talk to them all day, and you can't figure out that they understand even what it is or how it got there. It's just that they understand this guy's position and that guy's position. Here's Kant, and and here's Hegel, and here's Nietzsche, and they'll go on, and they'll dance with angels on the heads of pins about their different positions and stuff like this. But they still can't tell you, what causes one of them to say this and the other one to say that. And then they just assume that somehow the attachment to a certain consistency of argumentation inside their analysis, entitles them to credit. And there they are. Here's somebody who is a systemic thinker, and they've taken positions that are apparently consistent with each other, and so somehow they have mysteriously risen in the academy to be acknowledged as great thinkers, and yet half of them are crazy and they commit suicide and talk to horses, and have all kinds of experiences that they go through, and yet they're still esteemed, And so what I'm trying to say to you is that I want you to have an understanding of philosophy that is grounded, is rooted in cosmic reality. And I want us to come to grips with the all-important phenomenon that is active in the world right now of quantum physics, in the understanding that are being come to in the world of science, where they are recognizing certain aspects of reality in the field of quantum physics, which are in fact totally and absolutely contradictory to the most basic assumptions in the world of physics that dominate and control the academy at the present time. And that is the classic Newtonian Cartesian worldview of the fourth paradigm, in which they basically insist that nothing is true unless you can in fact prove it, weigh it, measure it, see it, and that nothing exists as true until that has been done. And so they just exclude from the world of reality all of those things that they can't understand. and that they can't explain through the realm of scientific, logical, positivist, Newtonian, Cartesian laws of physics. You know? And the most important aspect of this is this absolute dichotomy between the material world out there and human intention. It's the great divide that they actually postulate, that our thinking and our intentions can have no direct effect upon the physical world unless we just come to a position through our will to engage in a certain set of physical activity that physically moves around the mechanical things in the world to move them toward a different set of things, a different set of positions than they might have been at random. And that's the only way we can affect the outside world. Whereas, in the realm of quantum physics, there are vast numbers of experiments that are being done now that are demonstrating that the mere directed intention of a human being on a physical field can actually alter the field physically. Okay? And there are two sets of major experiments that tend to become the subject matter of these discussions. One of them is the ability of a human being to affect what they call a random number generator. They have random number generators, these little machines. They're like little computers, and they're totally mechanical, and you rev them up and you let them run randomly, and they'll come up with a number. Odd number, even number, number over 100, under 100, over 1,000, under 1,000, etc. There are different categories for them. But what they've discovered is that a person directing their human intention toward a random number generator can in fact generate a statistically significant effect upon the randomly generated number. Okay? And the second one, and there's a book that's called I think the Boundaries of Reality. The Margins of Reality. The Margins of Reality. And what's the author?
There's two of them. It's Princeton research.
Yeah, it's a Princeton thing. I'll bring it in next time. But it's a major book called The Margins of Reality, and they talk about this particular field and all the evidence that's there, and basically begrudgingly acknowledging that it's clearly so, and that therefore somebody has to do something about this. And the second area is this area of remote viewing. That and I'll tell you a funny story. The first time I ever heard about this was about 1997. 1977. See, 1977, I ended up being asked by L. Ron Hubbard, who was the founder of the Church of Scientology. I was asked to represent L. Ron Hubbard and his wife, Susan. They were being besieged by the IRS and challenging them for not being a real religion. And anyway, I was on the way. Sarah and I were driving out of town, out of Washington. I stopped at a phone booth to check with Father Bill Davis over at the Jesuit headquarters just before Sarah and I were actually going to take a weekend off. And Billy said, "Oh, the people are hysterical. They're calling all the office here. Everybody's crazy. They're looking for you. You've got to go over to the major headquarters for the Church of Scientology right away." And so I went over there, and here are these big mass arrest vehicles that are all driven up around the headquarters of the Church of Scientology over on Mass Ave. And so I went up into there, and I found the head of the Guardian's office, and it turns out the FBI had descended upon the place, and they had this warrant authorizing them to come in and Xerox every single document in the entire building. And it was searching for evidence of the commission of the following crimes. And they would list a number of crimes. Then at the very end, then it said, and any other violation of any federal or state criminal statute. I mean, just an absolute general warrant to search every single document for any element of any crime at all. Now, right away, I said, there seems to be something wrong with this warrant. And so I got a copy of the warrant. I went over to the federal courthouse. I went in front of Judge Green on emergency motion. Within 15 minutes, I had a federal court order striking down the warrant. And so I drove back over to the place and showed it to the FBI guys that were all there, and they were all furious. And so we ordered their ass back into the mass arrest vehicles and get them out of there. And not only that, but give back every single Xerox copy you've got of every single document, and give back every single fingerprint you've taken off any document, and have a whole compendium of everything that you took out of this place, and you give every one of them back. So we won that. And a week later, they end up, an indictment comes down, or a grand jury set of subpoenas are issued up in New York, and they subpoena the top 10 leaders of the Church of Scientology in New York. And they drag them in front of a grand jury, and they start demanding information about what they had and what they met in their board meetings and everything like that. And so I went in, I got called, and I went in and I struck that down and got it stopped. And so L. Ron Hubbard decided he wanted me to be his lawyer, right? And so I said to him, I said, as a condition precedent, before I even agreed to discuss being his lawyer, that you would have to agree to give me access to every single document in the entire church, anywhere in the world. Or else I'm not even going to go meet with him. And so I figured that was a non-starter. But it turns out within a week, they called back and said, you got it. Go down to the Blue Cube, down to Lake something in Florida, to this great big headquarters building that we got down there. So I go down there, and I bring my chief investigator with me, Bill Taylor, out of Florida. So we go down in, and I'm sitting there with the guardian, the chief guardian from England, from the London office, and then the head guardian from the United States, and we're sitting in the meeting. And so he says to me, the chief guardian says, okay, what document do you want to see first? And I said, I want to see the file you got on me. And the guy from the United States guardian started saying, well, gee, no, why, we wouldn't have a file on you. We wouldn't take any file from you about you at all. So I turned to the head guardian. I say, what am I? You think I'm stupid here? What if I fell off some melon wagon on my way here? Just give me the file, or else I'm not going to have any more conversation. Are we all done here? And so he turns to the other guy and he said, go get him the file. So he goes in, brings the file back to me, and I'm leafing through it, and I say, okay, I just wanted to see if it was accurate. And so he said, okay, well, what do you want to see? And I said, I want to see the 3 most sensitive documents in the entire filing system, according to you, as the chief guardian. Those are the ones I want to see. So he gets all befuddled and kind of walks around. He finally goes out. He comes back about 15 minutes later. He's got these 3 files. And the first file he shows me is a file all filled in by a guy named Ingo Swann. Ingo Swann was a high-level clear of the Church of Scientology. It means those cans that they have that you have to hold on to and all that weird stuff they go through. Anyway, so he's a high-level clear, and so he's been recruited, it turns out, by the United States Naval Intelligence. I touched on this one time earlier, I think, in a lecture, where they were experimenting, trying to figure out how to communicate with nuclear submarines, because they were afraid if a nuclear submarine, one of our nuclear submarines, came up to the surface and tried to communicate, it could be picked up by a Russian satellite, and they could know where it is. So they wanted to figure out how to communicate with submarines under the ocean, right? And so that they had this experiment. I did tell you about this, didn't I, with the rabbits, where they brought the baby rabbits in and they tortured them, and they kept the mother rabbit at a place at Langley, and they had her hooked up to electroencephalograms and all this. And the instant that they started torturing one of her babies, clear on the other side of the world, instantaneously all of her brainwaves started going ape, and she started banging into the sides of the cages and everything. And so they could tell that there wasn't any question about it, that these baby rabbits were able to communicate with their mother in this high state of panic that they were in. And so they said, okay, good. This, really pretty crude operation, this group. But so they said, okay, well, this proves there's something going on. So let's get some of these psychic guys and get them in here. And what we're going to do, we're going to sit them down, and we're going to give them the longitude and latitude of a particular place, right down to the minute and second. And we're going to ask them to tell us what's there. And so they began drawing what was there, and they began telling other artists what was there. And turns out that a handful of these guys, Ingo Swann, Pat Price, and a few other guys, ended up having something like an 87% hit rate of being able to describe these places where they were. And so what happened is Ingo Swann, because he was a high-level clear in the Church of Scientology, viewed his loyalty to be to the Church of Scientology above every other loyalty, including his loyalty to the nation state of the United States. And so what he was doing is filing secret reports to the Church of Scientology, all about this work that they were doing on remote viewing. and telling all about the details of what it is that they were finding out. And they had actually gotten Pat Price to be able to not only draw a location that he could see in his mind, but he could also then go to the fence. I did tell you this. Could go to the fence. They say, okay, now go through the fence. Okay, I'm going through the fence. Now go to the building. Can you see the building? Yes, I can see the building. How many doors are there? There are 3 doors there. You say, okay, go to the one in the middle. Now I want you to go through the door. Okay, I'm going through the door. Go down the hall. Go to the 3rd door on the left. Go in there. Find the filing cabinet. So I got to find the filing cabinet. Now go into the filing cabinet. I want you to look under F. I want you to look under F and find this file and read it to me. And he would do it. That's a fact. That's a true fact. Okay? And I'm telling you, you won't find anybody in the academy that's going to acknowledge that that's true. Because it just couldn't be true. It just doesn't fit with anything that's going on in the academy at the present time. And yet there's an entire world going on in secret where they know that's true. Okay? And the academy, blithely going along, ridiculing everybody who engages in magical thinking, are completely ignorant of that. And yet it's happening. Okay? So what I'm saying is that this secret world that I'm talking to you about, this secret government, the shadow government, the deep state, all these things that we're talking about here, there's a realm where the people have dared to go beyond the normal thinking that's going on in the academy. And yet the academy maintains its sense of superiority and its arrogance, actually, vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And so that the deep state or the shadow government is able to function in a realm of secrecy beyond the recognition and assumptions of the academy. Okay, and yet we as intellectuals, as public intellectuals, still utilize the academy as the referent, the standard for what is respectable and what is going to earn you the respect of people like the New York Times and the New Yorker and the other the journals of science and stuff where you might want to publish, and so that what I'm raising with you here is the fact that what I want to do is I want to have you as public intellectuals in training to be aware of this other dimension of reality, because the way that the structures are set up right now, they've got structures set up which are making it impossible for us to do anything about what it is they're all doing to us if we accept all of their normal assumptions that they're foisting upon us. And so therefore you don't have access to anything. Like, well, I'll give you another classic example. I go over to see Scott Armstrong. Scott Armstrong was the president of the National Archives, National Security Archives. And I bring a copy over to him of our complaint in the Iran-Contra case, right? Detailing all these 26 defendants and how they're all smuggling cocaine around and selling weapons to people and assassinating people and doing all the stuff that they're doing. And he looks at this thing and he says, this can't be true. He said, if this was true, I'd know it, he says. And Scott was the darling of Peter Rodino. Peter Rodino was the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. And when they did the impeachment of Richard Nixon, and he was the Democrat that chaired the Judiciary Committee, a congressman from New Jersey. And Scott Armstrong is the guy who actually interviewed Alexander Butterfield in the White House and discovered that there was this secret recording system that was set up in the Oval Office that Richard Nixon had, where he recorded all of his conversations in the Oval Office. You guys have all heard about this as part of history, I think. I happened to be in the case where we discovered that it was true. And so because Scott had been the one that interviewed Alexander Butterfield and found out about this and basically blew a hole in the side of Richard Nixon and got him impeached and thrown out of office, he was this darling to Rodino in the Judiciary Committee. So I go over and sit down and show him the whole thing. And he says, this can't be true or else I'd know it. And I said, well, it is true and you don't know it. So what you should do is check with your sources now that I'm telling you what the details are, and you'll get confirmation that it's true. So he called me after a couple days, and he calls me back, and has me come back over to his office. He says, son of a bitch, he says. Turns out it is true. I said, yeah, I told you it was true. And so he says, I checked with some of my sources, including Cy Hirsch and others, and they didn't think it was true either, but they checked and found out it's true. He said, oh, great. He says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go over to Peter Rodino. Peter loves me, he says. And I'm going to go over there, and I'm going to show him the complaint, and I'm going to show him what we've got, and he's going to immediately put together a special select committee to investigate all of this stuff, and he'll make me the chief of staff for that, and then we'll impeach these bastards. Okay? And he says, so give me a couple days, and I'll get back to you. So a couple days go by, and I don't hear from him. A couple more days go by, I still don't hear from him. So I give a call over there, and I talk to Tom Blanton, who's his deputy, and I said, Tommy, what the hell's going on? Scott said he was going to call me back in a couple days. And he said, oh, Dan, he said, you got to come on over here. You got to come over, I got to talk to you. So I go over to the National Security Archives, and I sit down with Tom Blanton, and Tom says, gee, he said, Scott went over to see Rodino, and he gave him your complaint. He sat there and he read through the whole thing, and Peter Rodino, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee for the Democratic Party, says to him, my God, Scott, he said, look what this is saying. He's saying, look, he said, I've been telling all of my constituents that if they didn't like the way the American foreign policy was running, they ought to write a letter to their congressman. And if their congressman doesn't do anything about it, they ought to vote for somebody else and have a new congressman. But if what this is saying is true, why then we haven't even been in charge. I'm not going to allow the government of the United States to investigate anything like that, is what he said. Okay? So what they've done is they've got structures set up that they tell us in the academy, whether it's all the way from junior high school to junior college to colleges to law schools to graduate schools. In the academy, they tell you that there's a system in place and there's pieces that you can work with and you can make it work. But I'm here to tell you that it doesn't work. I'm telling you that they've rigged this system. They've structured this system in such a way that they can constantly put one hurdle after another in front of you. And you'll get over that hurdle and then there'll be another one. You get over that hurdle and there'll be another one. And eventually you'll hit right up against the wall where they basically say, fuck you. We didn't think you were going to get all this way, but you did get all this way, and now you know that ain't the way it works at all. You've come to the end of this road, and it ain't going to happen. Sometimes they'll invite you in. Now that you know, why don't you come on in and take advantage of this and participate in this? But most of the time they know better than to invite me.
Can you elaborate on why the Academy has so much skepticism of anything relating to this and why it is so vocal about that? Yes,
I can. Number one, that what you've noticed, and there's some essays that you can find about this, they're talking all about the major contracts that corporations have now with universities, and the Defense Department has them, et cetera. And the fact is that if the university gets out of line, they won't get these grants. The corporations won't come to them to have them do the research for them. The scientific laboratories, the pharmaceutical laboratories, and you'll notice that at the universities they're getting more and more concentration on these things like the chemistry department, the physics department, all of these kind of things. They're getting all these kind of contracts, and it's causing them to go. It's funding them. So they don't want to mess with that. All right. But then there's this other one that has to do with the religious institutions. That if you start talking about religious things, spiritual things, what they do is they ridicule it immediately, unless you're over in the divinity school. If you go over to the divinity school, that's a whole thing. They've got it all categorized over there, completely fucking useless. Is how they see it. It's for all the kind of fuzzy-headed people who can't really think like we can. Can't really get right down in and figure out 18 different nuances to Kant, for example. These people who don't have the discipline to go down that road, put them in the divinity school. let them go on over there where they can all talk to each other and they all pretend like they know what they're talking about with each other. And yet you drill down on it even over the divinity schools and they don't know what the fuck they're talking about over there half the time. That they've got people all over the boards on what they think theologically and metaphysically and everything else. Just to be clear about what my opinion is on that anyway. And so that what they do is they always say to you, oh, if you want to ask questions like that, go on over to the divinity school. But if you want to be serious and stay over here, where we get the contracts and we get the business and you get jobs when you get out of here, if you want to stay within these lines, then this is how you're going to do it. Okay? So that's largely why it is. But there's another more general thing, and Thomas Kuhn talks about this in the what's the big famous book that he's got there called The Theory of Structure of Scientific Revolution. Yeah, that whole big famous book that they've got is that what happens is there comes to be a whole lot of groupthink. They get into this groupthink thing, and everybody kind of just agrees with each other, and they talk in half sentences to each other, and they finish each other's sentences, and everybody kind of commonly agrees upon this thing. And if you know how to do all that, you just kind of rise, in the academy until you actually get tenure. And by the time you've not done the thesis you really wanted to do as an undergraduate, because they didn't want you to talk about that stuff, and you've then gone and got your master's degree, and you didn't talk about the stuff you really wanted to do your master's degree on, and then you got your PhD degree, then you managed to get a temporary teaching position. You have to spend 7 years before you're even considered for tenure. Then the 3/4 of the ones that even have done the 7 years don't get tenure. And the ones who get the tenure are the ones who've kowtowed, who've gone along with the structures and not challenged anybody on anything, in that they've done things like, the study of 2 footnotes on Keats, or something. And then they're the ones that because they've shown their fluency in the thinking of others. And so that they're prepared to teach the next generation about the thinking of others, but they haven't done any original thinking of their own, even though they consider it original because no one's written about that footnote. And that's how they do it. And I'll give you an example. That Danny Paul is my older son. He was at Harvard College, and he was in the political theory department, and he wanted to write his undergraduate thesis critiquing William James and John Rawls, 2 of the great deities at Harvard. That William James is the founder of the Department of Psychology at Harvard, and John Rawls was the longtime chairman of the Department of Philosophy. And Danny Paul wanted to write his undergraduate thesis critiquing William James for his premature abandonment of his original quest as a young scholar and thinker, trying to establish a mode of ethical reasoning that was rooted in the bona fides of the mystical experience. And that you could actually probe into it and actually make the argument that there is something normative about the experience, about the unitive experience, the pangenetic experience, as he referred to it. And you saw his lectures in Scotland called The Varieties of Religious Experience. It's a book you should have, one of those for your shelf. Get a copy of that. It's called Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. And he catalogs a whole set of these experiences that very well-known and respected people have talked about, that are these kind of preternatural experiences that they've had. And they talk about them. And he lectured about those in Scotland. And he came back to the university, and he was working at trying to do a major work on the bona fides of the mystical experience and its underlying predicate of the normative nature of the experience, so that it could become the ground of a mode of ethical reasoning, which could in turn generate a philosophy and its own political philosophy, right? But he abandoned that quest in the midst of the academy. He had 3 different sessions, apparently, of being asked to leave the university, and then came back, and then continued his quest, and then was asked to leave again, and so he finally gave it up, and he became the father of pragmatism, and actually started writing major things about. Let's all acknowledge that you can't really get anywhere on this issue of mystical experience. It's too ineffable, and people can't really articulate it, and you can't really do much with it. And so therefore, let's figure out how to be pragmatic about all of our decisions and pluralistic. And who can argue with pluralism, right? Anybody can argue with pluralism, because usually there's a truth and there's something that ain't true, and we can all be pluralistic about it. Let's vote on whether there's a chair there and then see what the vote is, But the bottom line is that he abandoned it, and he wrote many books on pragmatism and became very famous for it and ended up being the founder of the Department of Psychology at Harvard, etc. And so Danny Paul wanted to write critiquing him, but he wasn't even going to leave it at that. He was also going to critique John Rawls, who was the chairman of the Department of Philosophy, because John Rawls has written this major book called A Theory of Justice. I touched upon it. It's another book that you've got to have on your shelf. Not just for people to look at and say, oh, you've got John Rawls' book. No, you want to have it because you want to read it, okay, sometime in your life. And so you want John Rawls' Theory of Justice. And in that book, John Rawls ends up setting forth what has become sort of the definitive present operational theory of justice in Western civilization. And I just touched upon it earlier. We'll go into some depth about it in the coming course discussions we're going to have. But the bottom line is he ended up with a theory of justice which is completely materialistic. And that is it has all to do with distributive justice of goods and services, material goods and services. It's saying that the only really reliable criterion by means of which you can measure justice is the physical distribution of goods and services. And basically saying to himself, right? Isn't that right? Isn't that the only thing that a rational person can possibly talk about for a theory of justice? Dropping a footnote in his PhD thesis at the University of Chicago, which Danny Paul found, was that he said, the question about spiritual happiness and the maximization of consciousness and their degree of consciousness is a subject that is beyond the scope of this paper. Just drop the footnote just like that. Big black hole, just like that. Okay? So Danny Paul found that, and he wanted to write about that and say, look what about all that? Isn't it in fact true that there are writings by Hindu scholars and Buddhist scholars and others? The Hindus talk about 247 different levels of consciousness and different kinds of ways that you can instigate a particular level of consciousness and all these kind of things. So don't you think somebody ought to be talking about those things? And all of his thesis advisors said, absolutely not. No, that is not. You don't want to do that. And first they tell him right flat out, you don't want to critique Rawls. Rawls is the head of the department, so you don't want to do that. Just like let's talk about like being intelligent here. You don't do that. Because if you do, then they're going to pounce on you. Every single one of these would-be PhD people here that are here trying to get one of the 3 spots to come in to be a TA, right, are going to massacre you on this. And then they're going to show their grading of your paper to Rawls, how they beat up on you over this thing. So don't do that, okay? And so he kept trying and pushing and shoving it. They all just they were threatening to give him a B on the paper, if he did that. I mean, right out, no matter how well he did it, he wasn't going to get more than a B. They said, and that'll kill you. That'll kill you if we get into the master's program, either here at Harvard or the University of Chicago, the top 2 schools. So, I've had these long conversations with them, going back and forth on the phone, saying, fuck them. Are you there to really find something out and really push forward your own knowledge about something, or get a job or get a fucking position on the PhD crew, team? Well, the answer was the latter. The answer was the latter. Yes, I want to get into the master's program at the University of Chicago, and so I've got to be able to do this. So he cranks way back and he writes this kind of really mellow piece about Rawls and ends up getting a full scholarship at the University of Chicago to do his master's work under Nussbaum, who's one of the top 5 political theorists in the world, who writes critiquing Rawls in very, very minute ways, in dealing with all of his footnotes except for the big famous footnote. It doesn't deal with that. Okay? And so there he is now. Now he's on his way to Yale or somewhere else to do his PhD, and is learning the lesson. That if you're going to swim in the sea of the academy, you have to know how to do it. And they're training their people constantly to be able to stay within the parameters that they've defined for them. And what I'm saying to you is that all of us staying within the parameters that are being drawn for us in the academy are going to result in a total disaster. They're going to result in just the continuing onrushing of global climate change. They're going to have you not be able to think of solutions that are challenging the major structures of capitalism and transnational corporate capitalism and international banking arrangements. They're going to want you not to think about those things. And if you don't think about those things, we're headed right straight into the crapper. And that's what's happening right now. And so I want this course to be something different. I want you to be able to maintain all of the intellectual rigor, all of the intense discipline that you need to have to be an academic intellectual. But I want you to understand what the limitations are that the academy is attempting to impose upon you. And that you recognize those. You're not foolish. You don't just not even know they're there. I mean, you don't want to end up taking a drink of water and finding your throat leaking. You've got to know what these challenges are, and you've got to come to grips with them. And what I'm telling you is that one of the most important, if not the most important resource that you can possibly have in order to be able to do that is these things that people are talking about meditation, about a certain type of diet, of not eating the red meats, the not stimulating yourself with intense, spices and stimuli. The Hindus talk about them all the time, because what it does is it develops your consciousness, and it develops your consciousness so you're able to take into account experientially bigger and bigger fields of reality, and so you don't have to get indignant when some ignoramus from the Department of Philosophy, says something to you like, where's your footnotes on postmodernism? And you say, something like, if they were up your ass, you'd know where they are. You don't have to say something like that. You don't want to say something like that, even though you may be tempted to say something like that. So what you just say is, well, actually, I have addressed that, and it's in an appendix that I've put a note in there about that. Okay? And so what I'm saying is that I'm trying to bring to you the experience that I have as an academic, but as a trial lawyer that for 40 years has been practicing in front of juries throughout the country, trying to deal with concrete issues, like putting a witness on the stand telling about how she fled from El Salvador, when she saw her roommate, cut open with a bayonet, and the baby punctured with a bayonet and marched around by torchlight in the garden, of her fleeing to the church to get out of El Salvador because she was on a death list, simply because the doctor they worked for treated an 8-year-old boy that was shot at a demonstration against the government of El Salvador. You're putting this person on the stand in front of people who are citizens to hear what's going on, and you have the United States Attorney trying to block her testimony on the grounds that it'll prejudice the jury. And so you have this temptation of turning around and strangling him, on the spot, figuring that he isn't even entitled to live. And then you realize that that's the exact same attitude that the people have who cut the woman open and put the baby on the bayonet and walked him around in torchlight. That's what you've got to understand. You've got to understand that, okay? And that the way that you understand that in a way that makes a difference when that moment comes is by understanding what the greatest minds of the history of the world are trying to tell you. That there is this other faculty. There is this other resource that we all have to draw upon. And it can empower us. It can empower us to not go to those directions, to not slide down into the lower chakra energies of our body and respond with that kind of dialectical or survival kind of anger and aggression. that this is an important and valuable resource that we have. And I want you to think about it in practical, intelligent terms as an intellectual. Okay? So that's what I wanted to talk with you about today. That I want us to understand that this is a turning point in the course. All of the stuff that I've been talking to you about up to this point in time has been basically introductory for you to understand what some of the major issues are that we're going to be dealing with here. But I want to get down onto it now, and I want to start dealing with this model that I've developed over all these years. And and not because I've been sitting in some abstract, ivory tower somewhere at the academy. I've been out in the field and I've been working on case after case after case, and I have found it absolutely necessary for me to try to figure out what in the world is going on. How do we explain what we do to each other? How do we explain what happens with some other people to other people? How do we keep control over ourselves in dealing with some of these people when you're so tempted? I've sat in meetings of 20 Jesuits from Central America who are there having a discussion at the headquarters of the National Jesuit headquarters in Washington, D.C. about whether or not to carry a gun down in El Salvador. And whether or not armed self-defense against the military coming to take away innocent women and children and bury them in mass graves, whether or not it is legitimate to take up the gun against them. And I would recommend, if you haven't seen it, you ought to see The Mission. The Mission is a movie with Robert De Niro and several other people that are in it. But you ought to see The Mission. And it's all about a group of Jesuits down in Ecuador, I believe it was, or Colombia, back in the 17th century. And you ought to see it. I'm just recommending that you take a look at it. And you can pull it up on the internet, and get The Mission and watch it. And you see the issue that arose with them. It's the same issue now that I'm asking you to deal with. And that's what I want this course to be. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take as much advantage as I possibly can of having been given the privilege of getting to talk with you, in a setting like this, where you're at this particular stage in your educational process, And so I want to be able to tell you everything that I know and that I believe so that it can make a major difference in your life for the rest of your life and empower you to deal with this problem that we've got coming. Okay? So anyway, there we are. I'm glad to be back, and I hope you're ready for the rest of the course. Okay? Thank you.